Hi everyone, my name is Manal from Palestine. I'm the International Advocacy Officer of Stop the Wall campaign, a grassroots organization that is based in the occupied West Bank. I'm also a climate activist, a grassroots organizer, and a researcher focusing on Israeli environmental colonialism and Palestinian women's resistance. I'd like to give an overview about the increased Israeli violence in Palestine, especially last week. On the 9th of August, hundreds of Israeli soldiers invaded the city of Nablus and assassinated Ibrahim Nabulsi and Islam Sabuh, who are two fighters affiliated to Al-Aqsa Brigades, which is the armed wing of Fatah. They were assassinated after hours of clashes with the Israeli army, where Israeli soldiers also killed Hussein Jamal, who's only 15 years old. And Hussein was a bystander. He was on his way to work when an Israeli bullet killed him. What happened in Nablus was preceded by a brutal Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip just 40 hours before invading Nablus. The Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip resulted in the murder of 47 Palestinians, including 17 children, less than 3 days. Hundreds of others were injured during that. What happened in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank is part of one aim to strip Palestinians of the spirit of resistance, especially because Palestinian resistance has been increasing since the Unity Intifada of last year, which is just a response to intensified Israeli settlement expansion, dehumanization, and oppression of Palestinians in historic Palestine. Our resistance scares Israel because it is the thing that gives us hope that the liberation of Palestine is within our reach. Although those who've been killed, they don't pose any threat to Israel, but what poses threat to Israel is the fact that Palestinians would become more hopeful and will be encouraged more to resist and transform the dire reality we were living in. Women and children are directly impacted by intensified Israeli violence, especially because women in Palestine in particular, they are the doubly and the triply marginalized and oppressed because of patriarchy. And Israeli colonialism is just another layer of oppression added to already existing layers of oppression. So women are affected by violence directly simply by being killed by the Israeli army. The Israeli occupation killed more than 17 children in the Gaza Strip in less than 3 days. Women were also targeted and killed during the assault. Now, hundreds of families in the Gaza Strip, or hundreds of people, are now homeless because Israel destroyed people's homes. And women are the ones to endure this state of homelessness, especially those who lost their men who used to be their breadwinners during the assault. So this just increases the burden on women in the Gaza Strip. Talking about Palestinian women in the West Bank, particularly in the so-called Area C of the West Bank, where Israel is trying to ethnically cleanse thousands of Palestinians from their homes in order to make way for illegal settlement expansion, women are on the front line of the struggle, trying to preserve their existence on their land, and they are subject to home demolition. So they are the ones, again, who try to navigate ways and survival means in order to stay on their land. Home demolition for these women and cutting their access to water resources only increases the domestic burden on these women. This is not to talk about Palestinian women prisoners who've been enduring years of, and even decades for some of them, of oppression inside Israeli jails. Women are also humiliated at the workplace in Israeli corporations. They are sexually assaulted by the Israelis. And women are also killed and humiliated at checkpoints like Ghufran and in areas while they are doing their jobs, like Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. She was killed while she was doing her job. On the official level or the mainstream level, unfortunately, these world government, particularly in the West, they keep dealing with Palestinians as the ones attacking Israelis, and they keep emphasizing that Israel has the right to self-defense. And that is something that is reflected in mainstream media, which serves the interests of these colonial powers. They keep portraying Palestinians as the villain. They keep demonizing us, while Israelis are the victims who are trying to defend themselves from these Palestinian terrorists. Also, Western powers have shown double standards in terms of dealing with the Ukrainian and the Palestinian issues. They keep asserting that Ukrainian lives are mourned while Palestinian lives are not. And that is something embedded in white supremacist thoughts, that the lives of the colonized, the lives of people from the global south, are not valued or they don't count. At the grassroots level internationally, we are seeing increasing solidarity with Palestine and support from people across the world. And that is something that only gives us hope. And it is something that increases our steadfastness to continue our struggle against all odds. So we've seen recently people around the world taking to the streets, demanding their government to end their complicity with Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism. But still, we need more to be done. We need more pressure to be exerted on government in order to respect Palestinians' rights and stop being complicit with Israeli crime. At the regional level, unfortunately, while Israel was bombing Gaza, what we expected as Palestinians who are part of the Arab world in particular was that those countries or those regimes normalizing with Israel would stop their normalizing or suspend their normalization with Israeli apartheid. But they've never done so. They continue to strengthen their relationships with Israel. And that's why people in the Arab world should play a more active role in order to pressure their governments to end any normalization ties with Israel, because this is something that isolates us, undermines our struggle. It helps Israel to de-isolate itself at the expense of Palestinian existence. The role of Palestinian women's movement or grassroots groups, they've been playing a key role in taking part in organizing for protests in support of Palestinian detainees who are carrying out a hunger strike, like Khalil Awawda, who's been on hunger strike for more than 5 months now, and also to condemn and protest increased Israeli violence. Palestinian women are always on the ground organizing for protests and for direct confrontation with the Israeli occupation as a response to its crimes, increased violence, and ethnic cleansing practices. The problem lies within the Palestinian women-led organizations or NGOs. Their role is becoming more and more weak than before because they are co-opted by the international NGOs that give funding to them. And that's a huge problem because this is creating a vacuum in terms of the role of women, because those women-led organizations in Palestine, once they were, especially during the first Intifada, they were on the front line leading the Intifada, but now they are co-opted. So we're trying to find alternatives as young activists, as young women activists, in order to be able to fill this vacuum. To a certain extent, we are succeeding in that. But as I said, Israeli violence and brutality affects us all, affects the movement in Palestine, including the feminist movement. And it tries to undermine the liberation movement, including the feminist movement. And that's what makes the struggle on the ground becoming more and more difficult and more challenging. Feminist movements should play a role in fighting back against the ongoing and any upcoming normalization. They should raise awareness about what normalization means to Palestinians. To the Arab peoples, normalization doesn't badly affect Palestinians only, because the struggle of Palestinians for liberation and self-determination is part of the larger struggle of the Arab world. Feminist movements should strengthen their ties and relations with feminist groups in Palestine and create spaces for Palestinian feminist movement to be able to talk about the situation in Palestine, to address more Arab audiences, including women and men, because I think that is key in order to counter these normalization waves that are taking place, and also to raise awareness among other peoples to support us in our struggle and condemn normalization. Internationally, the feminist movement should emphasize how important it is to globalize the feminist struggle and not deal with the Palestinian case as a separate one. Our struggle for liberation is a feminist one. Actually, when we have feminism as part of our struggle, what we are trying to do is, or to realize, is radical change that is also liberating of women, not just liberating Palestine and our land and our people, but particularly the liberation of women. So globalizing the struggle is important. Emphasizing our joint struggle is something that is really matters to our resistance on the ground. Another thing feminist movements can play is to create more spaces where the voices of Palestinian women is more centered, so that we can expose Israeli crimes more to the world. Feminist movements can also take part in pressuring their governments or to be part of the grassroots pressure on governments around the world to answer Palestinian calls to investigate Israeli apartheid by the United Nations. I think investigating Israeli apartheid and reactivating the UN Apartheid Convention in order to impose targeted sanctions and a military embargo in Israel is something that will help in advancing our struggle and will also undermine Israeli effort to take over more of our land and to isolate us. We've noticed recently, or since the start of the year, an increased violence against Palestinian women by their men, be it by their brothers and by their fathers. So since the start of 2022, more than 18 Palestinian women have been killed. They were lost to the violence of patriarchy. And that is directly connected to intensified Israeli oppression, because in the absence of law and any protection measures for women, Palestinian men are more emboldened to commit more and more crimes against women. 12 of those who've been killed since the start of the year are Palestinian women with an Israeli citizenship. Why? Because Israel has been systematically spreading weapons among Palestinian citizens of Israel as part of Israeli efforts to make Palestinian communities there self-destroy themselves, which is another way or another tool of colonialism, what they call horizontal colonialism, because indigenous people keep saying that they are horizontally colonized when violence is spread among them, when they kill each other, and when they are addicts to alcohol and also to drugs. And this is the reality that Palestinian citizens of Israel, they are living. And those who are to bear the brunt of this form of horizontal colonialism are Palestinian women.